Hey folks, it's Terry Kelford here from the National Alliance to End Rural Remote Homelessness. Welcome to the town hall with Adam. We're really honored to have Adam come back again and meet with us and take the time to do that. We appreciate his commitment to having conversations with those of us concerned about rural remote homelessness. So my fellow co-chair Shane is not able to join us today, so I'm filling in for him because he normally takes the lead on these webinars for us. So, and I just want to start too, although we're on a webinar and most of us will be joining from across the country, I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous lands that we're on. For myself in Leonard County, we're on Algonquin traditional territory here. So we just want to acknowledge from coast to coast to coast the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people that we call this land home to us. So without further ado, I'm actually going to pass this over to Adam. Adam's done this for us before, so I'm going to allow him to introduce himself. But again, Adam has been quite committed to having conversations with us in rural remote communities about the National Housing Strategy. And obviously today, we wanted to have him on specifically to talk about the Rapid Housing Initiative. Big announcements coming to the federal government, towards a commitment to ending homelessness, which we think is fantastic. And we're always just wanting to have conversations about how rural remote communities fit within these funding strategies and federal policies. And so again, we asked Adam if he would come and give us the opportunity from rural remote communities across Canada to ask him some questions about the rural remote, the Rapid Housing Initiative in this case specifically. So we're gonna have Adam talk for a few minutes just about the Rapid Housing Initiative. And then I've got a few predetermined questions for him that we're gonna ask. And then we're gonna open it up to questions and answers from any of you who are attending. And so what we would ask for you to do while I'm talking, while Adam's talking, by all means, type in any questions you have into the question and answer box or the chat box, either one. We'll get those questions to Adam after that. So we're thinking probably 45 minutes today for the webinar, if not longer, depending on how many questions we have to field. But so on that note, Adam, I will pass things over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Charlie. And I'm speaking to you from the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, but they themselves, well, they have the treaty to the land. This territory is also home to the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and across Turtle Island as a gathering place. Toronto is often identified as such. In fact, that's where it draws its name. It also has people from Métis, Inuit, and a host of other Indigenous nations that now call Toronto home. It's important to note that as we talk about what we're doing in rural communities to fight chronic homelessness and end homelessness, simultaneous to this development of this policy, a new urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing strategy is also emerging, which will work hand in hand with the work to end chronic homelessness, of course, especially as so many communities that experience high rates of Indigenous homelessness. But we're also investing heavily into the co-op and nonprofit stream as well. There are 3 new chapters being composed right now for the National Housing Strategy. And the Rapid Housing Initiative, which we'll focus on today, is designed to during COVID, set the sector up for success downstream. So the Rapid Housing Initiative is part of our commitment to end chronic homelessness. It has a COVID-related component to it because of the emergency situations existing in so many communities across the country. And I'll get to the Rapid Housing Initiative in a second. But please understand that while we put $1 billion into that immediately, we expect billions more to flow into those other 3 streams to support our government's pledge to end chronic homelessness right across the country. And I'll add, as a member problem from a large city, we cannot end homelessness in Toronto if we don't end it in smaller communities. We have got to move upstream into prevention, upstream into smaller communities, and upstream in our funding models to make sure that all Canadians, regardless of where they live, get the housing supports they need to live independent and high quality lives in a safe and affordable way. So the Rapid Housing Initiative is a direct response to what we saw in the first phase of COVID, the first wave in the spring. We moved with a great deal of clarity and capacity to fortify the homelessness sector with top-ups to Reaching Home. $152 million in the spring, and then $236 million in August. And we are watching the sector very closely Because while we think that gets us to the end of the fiscal year in March, obviously we don't know the depth or the timetable or the impact of COVID in the second wave. And while we think this is a good preventative investment, we also realize that along the lines we may need to revisit it. And so we're in constant touch with the Canadian Alliance, with our municipal partners, with all sectors serving homelessness. The reason the Rapid Housing Initiative became so clear and so important, and these are conversations that we had back in the spring with the organization, with the Canadian Alliance, with other groups, is that spacing and social distancing and securing home for people is critical to managing COVID. But all we're doing is flowing money to you to flow to a motel owner or a building owner, and they just simply return people to homelessness afterwards. We are flowing money through the system, but we're not actually changing our capacity to respond to homelessness and solve it. And we're also spending a lot of money renting properties when we could be spending a lot less money to buy them, and then even less money to operate them as opposed to temporary facilities. So the Rapid Housing Initiative was put together, and thanks to all of your letters and hard work, and including the Canadian Alliance and Homelessness Recovery for All program, but also the mayors and voices that were brought to influence MPs and cabinet. What we ended up doing was taking a program that had been designed at $300 million this year, $600 million next year, and hope for some more reaching home money, into $1 billion now, $236 million now. And that's given us $1.2 billion in operating and capital to use this fall while we move towards a fall economic statement and a budget to do next steps. So whatever we talk about here today, it is the first surge. It is not the last surge, and there's simply more work, to be done, but we're doing that work already. So the Rapid Housing Initiative is a $1 billion program that was put together to acquire or to renovate or to convert or to create modular housing responses to facilitate depopulating our shelters and deconcentrating our shelters and getting people who are sleeping rough into better environments. We know that about 3,000 people across the country currently are housed in hotels, close to 3,500 now that we're into phase 2. We know that some communities, Toronto, for example, is spending $6,000 per month per person in some of these hotels. That's an extraordinary amount of money. You could buy a condo in Toronto for less. And so we want to get cities and municipalities into a position where they're acquiring assets and making long-term strategic investments to not only deal with COVID, but to set them up for success after COVID. We recognize that there are some challenges with these housing models. Especially as by larger and larger facilities, that operating dollars do become a bit of a question mark, and that medical supports as well are crucial around dealing with this population. We're working on that, but we're also cognizant of the fact that as we buy these properties and end the rental, the savings can also be invested back into operations, and that many of these individuals are receiving services at their existing facilities, and as we seek to depopulate those and spread the population into less concentrated areas, those operational dollars can also follow those individuals. So in the short term, we're not as focused on operational, but in the mid and long term, we know that we've got some work to do. The Rapid Housing Initiative is split into 2 program streams. One is effectively a $500 million fund for 15 designated communities. The other is a project-by-project application fund for every other community to apply to on a project-by-project basis. The reason we came up with some block funding is that our experience through the co-investment fund is that some of the larger cities have financial capacity that when you give them block funding, they can extend those dollars faster and further. Secondarily, we needed to prioritize some of the more complex systems, especially in the larger centers where you've got a high degree of people in core housing need, a high shelter count based on the last point in time count, which admittedly is a little out of date, but also where COVID is being measured or being impacted or tracked most markedly, and that still remains true, that the urban centers have much higher cases of community transmission within the homeless population than other parts of the country. Not to suggest that it isn't happening other places, but the large centers have a different dynamic to deal with and a different capacity to use these dollars. So the 15 largest communities, Toronto being the biggest, but others identified, they have block funding that their city governments can then partner up with the nonprofit sector, with Indigenous housing providers, with provincial housing systems, with their own housing systems, and they can extend their response much more quickly. And because of the size and, as I said, the scope of the systems that they run. But the second $500 million, which is open for application now through CMHC on a project by project basis, is 100% capital funding to acquire, renovate properties. And that can be accessed by any group, a municipality, a nonprofit, an Indigenous housing provider, as well as provincial housing systems to acquire properties for conversion and for use immediately, but also for enrollment into the housing system long term. There is some program design, which is a little finicky. For example, it's not about changing ownership of who owns what affordable housing in a community. It's about trying to extend and expand affordability. And so just simply buying an existing housing project and converting it to homelessness housing project is not looked as favorably as, for example, buying an asset that isn't currently considered housing, like a hospital or a school or a church, and converting that into permanent supportive housing. So we try to prioritize new housing. We try to prioritize housing that can be used immediately and that has good long-term potential, including redevelopment potential. All of this money can be used in conjunction with the other housing programs, such as the Canada Housing Benefit or the Co-Investment Fund. All of these projects, while there's 100% capital available to acquire, you can remortgage the properties to a limited extent, but a substantial amount, to do some of the renovations or purchase some of the furniture to realize the project. The flexibility is inside the program to do that. And in terms of its reach, well, we forecast $1 billion to acquire and create 3,000 new units of housing. What we're seeing is that in smaller communities, where a single family home that was on a main street in a small town that was being used for an insurance office, say, that's no longer being used by the insurance office, purchasing a house like that, converting it into a home setting where you've got 7 or 8 different units of housing for 7 or 8 different individuals with some supports on site. The unit cost drops remarkably quickly there, and we can actually achieve more than 3,000 units if in fact small communities access, if in fact small communities use house form buildings to house people. There's a real opportunity here to overachieve with this $1 billion, but the most important thing is to spend it quickly, to spend it fast. We can get the next $1 billion out the door. That's really the goal we have as we move to end chronic homelessness across the country. And with that, I'll open it up to questions and let Terry Lee monitor that process with the chat and the live questions, and hope I can answer some of your questions or clarify some of the opportunities here as we move forward.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate that. That was great. So I had a few predetermined questions for you, but I'm going to roll a couple of them in together because you've kind of addressed some of it as you've gone. So out of the $1 billion announcement, $500 million was designated for urban centers. Essentially, that's the 15 centers are designated communities, which means urban centers. Just curious about whether it's possible in the future for 2 things: for the federal government to make the same sorts of targets for rural remote communities, and I would include Indigenous communities in there as well as part of that. And if there's a way also for the federal government to make those dollars more accessible for rural remote, because one of the concerns we hear from the National Alliance is that when you're a small community with very little operational dollars to begin with and very little infrastructure to begin with, because not all communities actually get any money out of the Reaching Home rural remote stream. So because it's a competitive process and it's short-term funding, is there a way for the federal government to make it easier for rural remote communities to access those dollars, whether the application process is modified or whether there's actually targeted dollars specific to rural remote? What's your thoughts on that? Yeah,
so I mean, the reality is this first $1 billion is emergency funding, so we focus on getting it out the door as fast as possible. In fact, the argument we took to cabinet was that if we need this money in the hands of the housing sector now, understanding how dangerous the fall is for homeless individuals. That's when they get wet, that's when they get sick. We couldn't wait for a budget ask on this one. It was emergency funding. And at first they didn't understand the ask. We walked them through what the encampments look like in major cities and just explain to them, this is just, these tents will become body bags if we're not smart about this and work fast. And luckily, the Prime Minister, to his credit in particular, got behind this initiative. So the first $1 billion, we've sort of formulated around, you might remember at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness calls, and even on calls like this, we asked you for potential projects that you would look at to add to your housing mix to extend your effectiveness. We've kind of used those as possibilities to frame the conversation. So we've got a number of those from rural communities to look at how you want to spend this money. And so we hope we've created a program that you have easy access to. It's a pretty simplified application form, and it's pretty straightforward in terms of where the 100% capital would arrive. That being said, we recognize that even when we work directly with cities and rural communities, that cities sometimes in smaller, or towns in smaller municipalities, sometimes only have 2 or 3 people running the entire operation. And of course, homelessness is only part of what they have to apply for. So we're looking at how this money gets observed. We're tracking it. We're seeing where the rural response does or doesn't materialize. And when we come with the second installment, the learnings from the first will inform us as how we spend the second. I can't say right now whether that creates a dedicated stream. You'll often hear me say that I'm very nervous about dedicated streams because it tends to lock money into categories. And if there's residual dollars left over, nobody gets to spend it. And so we've been really heavily leaning on sort of less targeted dollars at the same time as trying to increase and use the dollars to move upstream much more quickly. So for example, one of the things we did with this was it's 100% capital dollars. There's no matching dollars required. That's often the biggest impediment to getting rural communities enrolled. The second thing was simplifying the process. And then the third thing was to prioritize, in particular, Indigenous populations within the scoring system, because we know that the rural community is massively overrepresented with Indigenous populations. As well, we also prioritized women, which also allows rural communities that are operating shelters for gender-based violence to add sort of phase 2 housing to the program, to also extend their emergency housing capacity as it relates to women facing domestic or gender-based violence. And so there's some flexibility in it that we think help the rural stream, but we're also going to be taking a look at where the dollars landed, and if a similar approach to big cities proves successful, is there something we can do for smaller communities in the next phase? So we're going to be looking to your learnings, and I'll be checking back in with you when some of the projects have arrived to see what worked and what didn't work to simplify that process. But I will caution you about these dedicated streams, that when the more dedicated streams you end up with, the more money you spend on administration. And we're trying to get this money to build and acquire and create as much housing as possible. And so for that reason, it's a little administrative light, so it can be program heavy. And that's why we landed where we landed. It's also why the block funding, which some, anytime that you don't see your city on a list, you start to ask questions why. This is especially true in Saskatchewan right now. We looked at a list of 25, we looked at 15, we looked at 12, we looked at 10, we looked at 6. And we landed where we landed because we thought it captured the large cities the best, and it captured the areas with the high number of encampments the best. But again, we're evaluating as we go, and we'll make changes as we move ahead. The block funding there was done to, again, simplify the application process for the city, so you didn't have the City of Toronto juggling 15 applications. They got block funding, they just report back to us how they spent it all. And so we are looking at ways to simplify constantly, but the 100% capital dollars and a dedicated project stream, we hope accommodates some of the challenges that have been identified.
Great, thanks, Adam. We've talked about this before, I think I've heard you say this before, is that, we have to put the money where the data shows it's needed. And that's, certainly we understand that. And I think it's certainly something with the National Alliance we've been really concerned about, is how do we quantify the need for homelessness in rural communities. And we have some interesting research coming out of Canada and the US now showing that homelessness is just as prevalent, if not more prevalent actually, in rural communities than it is in urban centers. And so one of the things we've been concerned about at the National Alliance is the lack of federal strategy around data collection for rural remote communities. Because we find from rural, I say we as in rural remote, find we lose out to the discussion around urban centers quite often, in the sense it's kind of, again, the leftovers go to the rural remote communities. And when you say you don't like targeted funding, I totally appreciate that. But it does feel like when you make an announcement that $1 billion for housing with 500 million going to urban centers is targeted funding, really, right? So again, it's part of that. How do we justify, how do we as a National Alliance, and you don't need to answer this for us, but how can we ensure that rural communities are not left behind in this? And I would just add to that as well, that one of the concerns we hear from rural and small communities across Canada is that many of them are run by volunteers. I mean, I can speak from that from my own perspective. In Leonard County, we're supporting 85 kids a year, but it's run by volunteers. And so filling out these applications, going through these processes is really daunting for small communities who have an extensive need, but don't have the infrastructure from lack of funding, ongoing lack of funding to actually be able to. So even when the applications are streamlined, it's still really hard for them to have the support to actually get the applications in, certainly with tight timelines like December 31st. So that's a rambling question, I guess, but do you see any, I know you're saying there may be a second round of funding. Do you see any extension to the deadline of December 31st?
Well, I think the extension will be a second round of funding. I think that before we get another billion spent, we have to spend the first billion. And I think that the reality is that there is some really high needs pockets of very, very precariously housed people right now. I mean, in my riding alone, I've got 15 parks that have multiple numbers of tents in them. And those tents are not built for winter camping, and already we're starting to see some pretty scary fires and circumstances emerge in those encampments. And it's a scary time, especially when you look at it in terms of where homeless people in crowded cities go when it gets wet and gets cold. They go into libraries, they go into malls, they go into public transit, and the ability to spread COVID quickly is the reason we got this money out the door fast. So but I think what's important is not so much where the rapid housing lands with Chapter 1, but the commitment to end chronic homelessness cannot be done without better data. The commitment to end chronic homelessness cannot be done without rural communities having proportional access to the size of the problem they're challenged with. And therefore, both the money we've invested into the sort of the housing sort of secretariat around CHRA, the work that they're doing to help people access the fund, that's one way to get some expertise in there and to share best practices. And the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness is also sharing best practices. So when you see one project materialize and move through the system, we need to share the learnings from that so we make similar applications and achieve similar success. But I think you raise a good point that while we have increased funding to Reaching Home, that we need to build the data capacity, because even when we talk about what constitutes chronic homelessness in this country, there's sort of a 29,000 number, there's a 38,000 number, there's a 50,000 number. There is a component of homelessness that is invisible, that shows up differently in different parts of the country based on climate, based on the way in which the point in time counts are configured, the way in which people can or can't hide within a jurisdiction. Getting better data is going to give us better ways to stream the dollars. And when we see stubborn pockets of homelessness emerging, it allows us to then say, okay, this needs a particular approach. That's one of the ways in which the rural Indigenous stream is emerging, is that it's got to be Indigenous led. We know that, but it's going to look different in rural as it does in large centers. It's going to look different based on your proximity to a reserve. It's going to look different based on whether or not you're in the territories. So we're looking to get better data. We're looking to make smarter calculations. And if we see that our efforts to end chronic homelessness are working in the big cities, but not rural Canada, we're not going to end homelessness without preventing it. And if we're not moving upstream, it's not going to be successful in big cities. So we've got to figure out how to get better data out of the rural Canada and then design programs that respond to the data we collect. And we're committed to doing that. It's just this first trench of money is just, it's critically that we get it into the system now, as in should have been there in the summer, but we're getting there, and the second billion will be spent differently from the first billion, I can assure you.
Yeah, that's great. So we've had webinars before with Dr. Keller Copley. She developed a period prevalence count. She's got years of research to show the advantages to using that count in rural small communities compared to the PID count, which is used federally. But obviously, I think at the National Alliance, we'd love to have a federal data strategy as well for rural remote as opposed to just urban. So that's certainly a model that we've had Carol talking about quite a bit. So she rolled it out across Ontario, actually, so it makes sense to be able to look at it for a national strategy as well. Just throwing that out there. And I would just say, actually, before I pass it over to some of the questions we're getting from the participants watching. One of the things we are doing is trying to elevate the conversation around homelessness, that it's not just hidden in rural remote communities. It's in that it's not just couch surfing. So, I mean, my organization in Cornerstone Landing in Lander County was started because a gentleman died outside with, mental health issues and struggles, and nothing in the community could have provided them with housing at that time. So, it does look actually very similar. The features of homelessness look very similar in rural remote communities. People do sleep outside, are in tents, there are tent encampments. You just don't see about it. And I think the other thing that I've noticed in being someone who's trying to build up the momentum around a conversation around rural remote is that there's very little media coverage of rural remote homelessness as well. All the language in the national media sources is urban centers, cities, city homelessness. And so it's something we're definitely trying to work on ourselves, just to try to change that conversation a little bit. Certainly, as we also recognize that migration is a huge factor too. So, I mean, the federal PIC counts themselves from across the country show that, sometimes a large majority, like places like Yellowknife, a majority of the people are not actually from Yellowknife, they're from surrounding areas. So it's definitely something when you talk about prevention that we need to look at. So partially because, again, to get back to the RHI is that rural communities have to be in a position to be able to jump on these funny announcements when they happen. And if they're just ill prepared to begin with, it's really hard for them to react this quickly to these types of announcements. So yeah. I'm looking forward to a second announcement too.
Yeah, no, and I really want to stress that where COVID is in large numbers is driving a lot of our decision making, because the first wave was emergency funding and tied to COVID response. That way it didn't go through a budgetary process, or even but where it does show up and where you should be hopefully inspired is that the throne speech language on pages 19 and 20, where they talk about where we talk about committing to ending chronic homelessness now. We can't do that if we don't do it in rural Canada. You're part of, and I totally appreciate, and Reaching Home recognizes that the rural stream is different, needs to be counted differently, responded to differently. But as I said, if we don't do it, we're not going to stem the flow of people into homelessness. And if you want to solve housing crisis in Toronto, you've got to solve it upstream into the rural communities, because not every homeless person in Toronto comes from Toronto. We all know that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's interesting you bring that up too around COVID responses as well, because from what I've heard from our partners across the country is there's no way to actually quantify the amount of people who are homeless in rural remote communities who contracted COVID as well, because there's no system in place to do that. So sometimes there's a no fixed address criteria on COVID people who are COVID positive, but they don't necessarily indicate whether that's homelessness or just an oversight in admin, and that they just didn't capture the person's address. So in talking to our local public health officials and medical officer of health here, there is no way to actually flag people in rural communities who are homeless who tested positive for COVID, as opposed to what I've seen in urban centers where they're much more organized and there's a larger voice. They can say, hey, we've had 632 cases in Toronto shelters, right? And it's often shelters able to identify when they've had outbreaks. So, but it's a challenge in rural communities to actually even identify how many people have been positive and affected from our homeless population with COVID. So, okay, so questions actually. We've got a question here from Michael
Shapcott.
Yeah, Michael Shapcott. Can you see the question actually, Adam?
Yeah, I've got the chat up, so I'm just reading it. Hello, Michael. Good to hear from you. Finance development, property management, and tenant support. So the question is that the bigger systems have within them a sort of economic or structural advantage in terms of administration and supports required to make acquired housing successful for their residents. Smaller communities have less capacity there around that. Yes, we recognize this, and so part of what we're simultaneously working on right now is developing the support systems that are going to make this housing successful. First, you got to isolate people and secure their tenancy. But we're starting to see even in Toronto that when you do it in a unit of 150, and you've got sort of people who are addicted to opioids on one floor and people who are traumatized for this reason, other reason on another floor, and when you commingle populations, you create all kinds of unintended problems. So breaking the system down to smaller pieces works, but municipalities don't like that, because when you break it down to smaller pieces, you create new management costs and new staffing challenges, and a whole series of other issues. In rural communities, that becomes even more pronounced because you didn't have those supports to begin with. So we're looking at how we top up the Health Act, particularly around mental health and addiction issues, to get those support services into this new housing, which will have to be supportive housing to some degree. We're looking at some of the things we've done during COVID around safe supply in particular, to get people properly isolated, but to make sure whatever they consume is safe and not going to create other problems with overdoses or poison drug supply. We're looking at some of the pilot projects we've launched in Toronto to get that done. And we're also looking at Reaching Home as to whether or not Reaching Home needs to be permanently boosted as part of our campaign to end chronic homelessness immediately, to get into those areas where you've got to acquire people's social assistance, you've got to stream in those services to manage and to make the housing successful. We are looking at where this first $1 billion lands, what the lessons are from that around supports, but we also recognize that the longstanding need for supportive housing requires supports, and so we have to provide more than just capital funding to make this work. And that's going to be especially true in rural communities where the infrastructure just doesn't exist. So the answer is we don't have funds immediately for you. We want you to get the property first and then show us what systems you want funded. But we do have, we are anticipating for the budget, as we commit and fulfill our commitment to end chronic homelessness, that those services have to arrive, and they have to arrive every corner of the country.
Yeah.
Just no catching on.
You and I've had this conversation before, Adam, about the Reaching Home stream. I know I keep going back to it, but I think that's the feedback we're getting from rural remote communities as they look at, the REH program, for example. Again, really excited, but feel like they're going to miss out just because they didn't have the ongoing funding to begin with. So the way the Reaching Home stream of funding for rural remote works now is it's, in our opinion, so underfunded that, and it's a competitive process, so that every year you're having to apply, you don't know if you're going to get it or not. And so we hear from places like Ontario that there's, $6 or $7 million worth of applications with only, $1.5 million worth of funding. So the majority of rural communities are getting $0 out of Reaching Home every year. So again, they just feel like they're so far behind the ball when it comes to jumping on these opportunities. It's not that they're not excited about it. It's not that they don't appreciate the commitment that the federal government is making to addressing homelessness. We definitely, hugely grateful. I hope I say that enough. But at the same time, just making sure that, rural communities don't get left behind in these announcements.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it as we've gone from $50 million a year in funding, which was frozen from 1999 until we increased it to 100. This year we spent close to $500 million on Reaching Home. Mm-hmm. And so there's been, hopefully new resources right across the board, as well as enrolling 6 new communities. Without taking money away from the rural stream to do that, which hopefully meant that there was more to go around. But it's clear that while we were stepping up, we weren't marching forward. We were simply joining. I think it was needed investments, but we're not solving the problem. Now we're committed to solving the problem. I think you're going to see those supports substantially increase. We just had a conversation with CMHC about the urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing program and rolled their Reaching Home funding into that sort of basket of programs. It's clear that it's not enough, and it's clear that we have to do better, and that's part of the thinking as we move towards phase 2 as we fulfill our commitment to end chronic homelessness, the funding for the coordination of the services and the management of the delivery system, that's something we're going to have to speak to. We're also very focused on making sure provinces don't leave the space. As we invest in new resources, we have to make sure that provinces don't vacate the space. And so our provincial federal housing accords may need a new chapter added to them to deal with chronic homelessness. But we're acutely aware of how rural Canada has been dealt with and needs to be dealt with differently.
Yeah, Erin Shea just said that. Well, she was agreeing with what we were talking about in terms of rural communities not having the infrastructure in place to jump on these opportunities, but also she's pointing out that rural communities are often having to adapt homelessness programming and policies that are very southern and urban based, which is true. I did a tour across Canada about 6 years ago, going to look at urban centers and some of the models they were creating to help us back here in Leonard County. And after a couple of years, I stopped doing it and said, okay, I'm going to start developing our own programs, because scaling down is sometimes really challenging for us. So, lots of rural remote communities don't have a shelter, and never will, which, you know, can be seen as an advantage in some respects in that they're going to go straight to housing as opposed to emergency responses. But it also means they get stuck in that cycle of not having any emergency responses. But
And you think of hospitals and the prison system and child welfare systems projecting people into homelessness. So even though we're committing to ending chronic homelessness, the need for emergency housing is not going to disappear just because we no longer lock people into chronic homelessness. And that's where I think you're going to see transformation in the sector over the next few years. Is you're going to see much stronger social housing investment, which is also part of the throne speech commitment. So you're going to see a much stronger capital stream supporting and operating dollars in some cases to support co-ops and nonprofits. That's going to prevent homelessness, hopefully, right across the country. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have people with deep needs that aren't being served by family or community. And so we're going to have to figure that supportive housing piece out, and that requires housing with supports, and that requires a program that deals with the checkerboard of funding that's available to rural communities. But we're smart. I hope we're smart about that, and we certainly understand that scaling down or the micro programs that respond to particular communities need to be respected.
So Adam, we're going to have a webinar coming up with the National Alliance too, where we're going to have folks from FCM and CMHC come on to talk about the capital funding streams and how those dollars are accessible to rural communities too, even outside the RH program that you guys are offering now. But one of the things we're going to be asking them too is about whether it's possible to have CMHC, for example, has designated experts for areas, regional experts, I think they call them. Would it be possible to have experts that are also trained or aware? Maybe you can't answer, the CMHC and FCM are going to have to, but is it possible to have people who are actually become experts in actually knowing the challenges and barriers for rural communities to actually specifically be able to help them? Because it's a very different conversation when you talk to rural communities versus urban centers about how to apply for those funds and what the challenges are.
Yeah, I mean, one of the breakthroughs on rapid housing was 100% capital, which is going to be huge for smaller communities. We've certainly heard from caucus members that yeah, you've got 30% financing, 30% capital, 70% financing, but we can't manage the portfolio, period. Yeah. So the 100% capital hopefully helps rural communities access those funds more quickly and more determinedly. Yeah. But that being said, one of the ideas that's coming out of Newfoundland, and there's some merit to this, is to stop making rural communities design their own projects top to bottom. Sometimes it's the acquired expertise is the prevention. It's not the funding model that doesn't work. So you just don't have the collection of expertise around an application to make it to get it through. The idea would be to have sort of a 6-unit, a 12-unit, 25-unit sort of kit that once you put the land in place, you just apply for one of the projects, you just determine what size you want, and bingo. If you think of the way Viceroy Homes, you can order 3 or 4 different versions of a cottage, and bingo, they build it for you. The idea here would be to say these housing models are pre-approved. Pick the scale of the program you want, show us the base criteria, and away you go. You don't have to convince us it's energy efficient. We know it is. You don't have to convince us it's successful. We know it is. You don't have to convince us it's got long-term viability. You have basically IKEA style kits that just show up in your community and build the housing. That, I think, is one of the things we need to move towards. And the Parliamentary Secretary for Rural Affairs, Goody Hutchins, who's on the west coast of Newfoundland, is working with some housing providers to try and figure out what the scale of that project would need to look like. In which case we just start shipping you housing kits as opposed to making you design your own programs top to bottom. So we're looking at ways we can facilitate quicker access for smaller communities. Great.
Yeah, we've spoke to Goody. She's great. It's nice to have someone from a rural community be able to advocate for sure and speak from experience around that. So just to go back, Faye Martin, Dr. Faye Martin has asked, are you saying that, so this goes back to the question around COVID and where the data is where the money's going to go to support it. So are you saying that low infection COVID areas are at a competitive disadvantage in this tranche of funding? Because I might remind that COVID cases get attributed to health service connection rather than where they are when affected. That's actually in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box, Adam. You see that? Adam may be frozen. Michelle, are you available?
Yes, he might be.
Okay.
He might be frozen, which is unfortunate.
I never know if it's my screen or someone else's on your
No,
side.
it looks like that he might be.
I would have made a joke about rural broadband, but I suspect Adam's in an urban center, so I won't do that.
Well, both, yeah, it's a very good question. Maybe what he'll do is he'll re-log in.
Yeah, if anybody else has any questions, by all means, type them into either the chat box or the Q&A box. I know Shannon's got a comment here too, so a question here as well. We'll just give Adam a minute and see if he comes back on. Otherwise, to suspend.
Well, we could always send him the questions as well, but I think he's logging back in. There you go.
Adam, I just said I was going to make a joke about rural broadband, but I suspect you're.
Yeah, I'm just getting rid of my computer. Just stopped working, so I'm just gonna move it away. It's making a weird alarm sound. So I'm back.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
So it's just a question from Faye around how COVID infection actually gets identified and where it gets identified to, and so how that affects that whole data issue versus connection to funding.
Yeah, it's not a hard and direct relationship. We measured our 15 communities against to make sure there was no significant outbreaks and clusters in communities outside the 15. And so we checked with public health on that front. So there's not sort of a chart I can show you what the top 25 communities for COVID outbreaks are, because that's a fairly fluid, fluctuating number. But we were trying to make sure that the maps matched up. Yeah. And we accept the fact that especially in Manitoba, where there's a whole lot of community transmission that's sort of being cycled through the fluid relationship between people living in Winnipeg and then going to home communities and back and forth with seasonal employment, with school, with medical treatments being when people fly in for a non-related condition, but they get into a healthcare setting, sometimes they pick up COVID and return it. So it's not perfect, but we did check against the COVID centers, and we don't think we've missed out on any. That was to justify the emergency response. Every step we take from here on in is about ending chronic homelessness, not about COVID. But the first $1 billion did have a COVID component to it, and that was to get it through Treasury Board and through Finance, who said that this was just regular housing money. This wasn't COVID related, and we showed them why it was COVID related to get the dollars out the door. So I don't get too locked in to the first envelope. What I think is important is to access it where you can, and then to show us for the second envelope what you would do differently to prioritize rural communities or work around some of the structural impediments that disadvantage rural communities from accessing programs like this. We think we're in a good space in terms of 100% capital financing. We think we're in a really good space in terms of the efficiency that rural communities can show when they purchase properties because of their ability to redevelop the sites later, or to get multiple people into smaller buildings and therefore drop the unit costs. And the real estate values are different, obviously, in smaller communities than they are in the big cities. We hope that you can overachieve with these dollars, and doing so, it shows us that the faster we fund rural programs, the quicker we stem the flow into the large cities, and you become effectively the opportunity to fund first, because the impact will be so quick and so dramatic and so obvious. And so what may look like is a disadvantage now based on the COVID screen may turn to your advantage in terms of your effectiveness to use the money quickly and to use it to house more people faster. And that may prioritize your applications in the second stream.
Okay, great. And then Shannon has a question here about seniors housing. So is there funding forthcoming to help house precariously housed seniors in rural communities?
Yeah, it's not age specific. So you can use the Rapid Housing Initiative to house seniors who have multiple complications and need social supports to survive COVID. One of the things that I've been asking and making everyone speak to is that when we talk about long-term care is just another form of supportive housing. And in Toronto and some of the larger cities, the fastest population group that's growing right now is seniors who are homeless. They can't afford to get into long-term care, but they can't stay in their own homes, and therefore they become homeless seniors. There was a case in Toronto this weekend of an 80-year-old woman who also happened to have COVID. She didn't realize it because her symptoms were so different. But the reality is that we are working very hard in caucus and in cabinet to make sure that long-term care and supportive housing are seen as one and the same, and that the continuum of care for people who are aging, who are also experiencing health and economic issues, that their supportive housing may look like long-term care at the end, but in between it's just regular supportive housing. And we need to make sure the continuum of care for seniors in our communities are spoken to. So seniors are considered part of the homeless population, and their supports, while they may be spoken to with more clarity around the provincial healthcare systems, the reality is those supports disappear when they go into the homeless sector quite often, especially in mid-sized communities near rural centers. You will see that the dollars are there for long-term care in ways they aren't there for homeless shelters, even though it's the same population with the same illnesses. We need to fix that, and part of what we're doing is talking to Patty Hadju, the Minister of Health, that when we step up and invest into long-term care, the services that make long-term care housing, the housing that has care, that those services get extended into programs that serve seniors who are homeless as well.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Last chance. Anybody have any questions of Adam? Make sure I haven't missed anything myself here.
Listen, Taylor, what I will offer, you know how to get in touch with me, and you're in touch with your sector on a regular basis.
Yep.
When applications start to come forward, if 5 or 6 or 20 or 30 per province or whatever the number is start to apply, if you start running into problems at CMHC and they start reading your applications incorrectly or differently or not in a way that makes you happy, my role as a parliamentary secretary, I can't get you the money, but I can certainly ask questions you're not getting answers to, and I can certainly check to make sure that the head of CMHC is giving us the same answers as the frontline staff are giving the housing system. So when the rural communities start to make application, and we already know that some have started, if you get particular projects that stall, please reach out to me and let me feed you back the answers. Sometimes when they know the minister's office is watching a particular project, it gets dealt with a little bit more creatively, I might say, than when it's just a straight up application. And sometimes the answers you get require some interpretation, or there may be similar projects in different parts of the country that have solved it by doing A, B, and C, and we can share those best practices with you. So as the rural sector applies, please keep a sort of a tally of who's applying and where, and then keep us abreast of systemic problems or structural problems that seem to be disqualifying communities, because it'll help us redesign the second one, but we may also be able to reach into CMHC and get them to reevaluate projects based on different criteria, if those different criteria are possible to add to the mix. So keep in touch with us on this, and let's evolve it and reform it and make it more effective as we go by, based on the applications you actually submit, not on the theoretical problems we think we might have, but on the actual practical challenges we face. And as I said, you know how to reach me, my Hill office. And I'll be happy to help champion making sure rural communities get the funding they need, because it's got to hit every corner of the country.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Adam. So you heard it, folks. Let us know. So on that note, Adam, thank you again very, very much. I really appreciate that you make yourself readily available to have these conversations. We really appreciate it, and we know we know that you're quite devoted to getting this done in Canada, so we really respect that and appreciate your time. So I know you're busy now.
And regardless of what party your local MP is, when you make application, tell them, and that way, when they're in Ottawa or we're in Ottawa or on committees, I can at least ask them what they're doing. I mean, it's a lot of the folks, I don't think anybody doesn't want this program to succeed. The question is, will it succeed in their community? And so I have no problem working across party lines to make sure that opposition-held ridings get access to this programming. The other parties, Conservatives in particular, tend to have a lot more rural members than we do, although we're pretty good. But the truth of the matter is that this is not a program designed to help government members get access to the program. This is about ending chronic homelessness, and every community creates it, every community has it, and every community needs support. So keep your MPs involved, and when you have a challenge, if you hit one of those stalls, I'll be reaching out to your MPs as well to make sure they're aware of the fact that they need support, and for the MPs to get in line and help promote this program as well.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, Adam. So on that note, we'll wrap up. Thanks very much, Adam. For those of you who are not on our membership list, consider going to the National Alliance website and joining up there, because then you'll get access to all the notifications for the webinars. We're gonna have a whole series coming up, including, like I mentioned, the one where we're gonna have folks from FCM and CMHC on to talk about the capital funding streams there, outside of the RHI announcement as well. So again, thank you, Adam. Thank you for your time. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.